Great. So
Okay.
okay, go ahead. Sorry.
Sure. Again, I just want to welcome everyone for joining us for today, for Nikki's presentation today. This is one of many educational programs that we offer to small business owners and entrepreneurs by our center at the University of Arkansas Small Business and Technology Development Center. And if you're not familiar with us, we are a one-stop shop for startups and existing businesses and affiliated with the Small Business Administration, as well as a nationwide network of small business development centers. So again, for today's presentation, post any questions or comments that you have in the chat, and Nikki will answer those. So I'm going to go ahead and say hello to Nikki and let her introduce herself and get started.
Great. Thanks so much, Julie. I am excited to be here today to chat with you guys about smartphone photography. It's one of my favorite things that we do at the center is provide training for small business owners to be able to take your own pictures on an ongoing basis. I'm typically, whenever I go to a shoot and work with a small business, I'm only there for a couple of hours, and I'm only really able to capture what we can show during that time. But as the small business owner, you are in a position that's super unique and just powerful in a way for you to be able to tell the story of your business. So at the center, we try to equip small business owners with skills to be able to take beautiful pictures that help tell the story of your organization so that you can use them on social media or on your website, different marketing ways like that. So, so it's super fun to be here with everybody. Today, we're going to cover some pretty basic concepts of photography. A lot of the things that we're going to talk about towards the beginning are really camera independent. So whether you're shooting with a smartphone or a DSLR with tons of bells and whistles, or a disposable camera that you take to Walgreens to have developed, which don't choose that option. But if that's what you're shooting with, a lot of the things that we're going to talk about today will be applicable to your camera. We're going to start with talking about light, which as a photographer is truly the most important element of photography. Using light wisely, we're going to focus specifically on natural light because it's always available and it's always beautiful. And so it's also just much more convenient to learn how to work with natural light effectively, so that you're not having to worry about trying to bring in special lighting. So we'll start with lighting, and then we'll move on to composition. And the composition techniques that we're going to discuss today are actually not even photography specific. They're just really art composition techniques. And so they will help you guide your viewers' eyes through your photographs to be able to help tell your story more effectively. So that's a really fun part of the presentation. And then we'll move on to some more smartphone specific topics that have to do with the cameras within our smartphones. And we'll touch really briefly at the end on editing. We do have a specific course on editing. Julie, you have to help me remember whether that's something that is on demand and they could access that all the time or not. But that course is specific to editing, and we talk through an editing app that I really love called Lightroom Mobile. So if you're more interested in the editing conversation, you can we'll check with Julie and see if that's something that's available on demand. So a couple of things that I would love for you to share, you can share in the chat function, just to help me tailor our conversation today, specifically to the audience, is I would love to know if you have any specific goals for our time together today. Are there certain things that you'd really love for me to try to cover if I can? That's probably the most important thing for me to know. I would love to know what kind of smartphone camera you are shooting on, whether it's an Android or an iPhone or something else, if there is another option. That's helpful for me to know also. And then if you would like to share, I have an idea about some of the businesses that might be represented today, but if you want to share more specifically, like certain things that you know that you'll be shooting on a regular basis, so that we can kind of talk through that, whether it's product photography or food or something that's more action-based, that'll help guide our conversation too. So anything of those topics or something else that you think would be helpful for me to know, I would love to know. So Julie, we'll just give them a few minutes to share some things in the chat, and then maybe we can talk about that. So I am going to be bouncing around just a little bit between my computer screen, and then I'm also going to go onto my phone camera screen. So it's not going to be graceful or pretty, but I'm going to do my best. So.
And Nikki, just wanted to say that we do have that webinar that you mentioned.
Oh, good.
On our resources page, and I have copied and pasted that into the chat. So anybody that wants to go back and review that at a later time, they can do that.
Perfect. Thanks so much.
Mm-hmm.
So I'll go ahead and start sharing my screen. There we go. Okay. So like I mentioned, we're going to talk about some pretty basic intro kind of one-on-one photography techniques for capturing those eye-catching photos. You know, as we know, we live in this world of social media where people are scrolling and through millions and millions and millions of pictures. And so really our goal is to sort of get them to slow their scroll down. You know, we want to capture our customers' attention as quickly as we can, and the easiest way to do that on social media, of course, is with beautiful images. And so so that's what we're going to focus on today. And this is something that I truly believe Ansel Adams said the single most important component of a camera is the 12 inches behind it. And that's something that you'll hear a lot when you hear professional photographers talking, because oftentimes the first thing that people ask us is, well, what kind of camera do you shoot with? And the truth of the matter is that it's really not the most important thing. The most important thing is the person who's doing the shooting, because you can use a disposable camera or you can use a cell phone camera that will, you know, that's not the most complex camera on the market with tons of bells and whistles and power behind it, but you can still create really beautiful pictures that help tell the story of your business. So I kind of mentioned this just a second ago. Some of the things that we'll cover today are light and those elements of composition and some storytelling techniques that are fun to play around with. And then we'll talk about smartphone specific considerations like settings and modes and a little touch on editing. I doubt we'll have time to really get into the editing today, but I always put that on there because I'm hopeful, but then I end up talking so long that it doesn't, we don't get to that point. And then we'll end with what I think is super helpful practical tips and tricks to getting the shots that you want. Everything from making sure that your lens is clean, because these cameras are like in our back pockets and in the bottoms of our bags and they get filthy. So everything from that to really working on creating a varied gallery that's easy for you to access within your phone so that you have a portfolio of photographs that are helpful and that you can draw from when it's a Tuesday afternoon and you really need to post something on Instagram. There's nothing going on and you don't really have anything to take a picture of right then. Building that that gallery of photographs is really important, and it takes a lot of the stress off of keeping up with your social media stuff. So like I mentioned before, you really are your company's best storyteller and photographer. You are there all the time. You're the ones who know your customers, you know your employees, you know your mission and your values. So with just a few really basic tips and tricks and a little bit of photography knowledge, you can really step in and become the best photographer for your business. So we'll start talking about light, and it's not all created equally. So we'll talk about a couple of different types of light, specifically natural light versus artificial light. So natural light is always going to be the prettiest. It's always going to be the most flattering to your skin tones and your subjects, and it's also it requires the least guesswork because it is clear, and it's artificial light tends to have a temperature that changes based on the different types of light that we have. So an incandescent light bulb will look really warm and kind of orangey on your camera. An overhead fluorescent light's going to end up looking kind of yellowish, greenish, and a little bit sickly. Whereas that natural light is something that you can pretty much always rely on to provide that really pretty clear, flattering light. But when we talk about natural light, there's lots of different types of natural light. So here on the left, we have a little girl, obviously, who is swinging in the light, and the light is behind her. So that would be even though she's facing the light, from the photographer's perspective, that's a backlit photograph. And so the light is on the other side of the subject. And you can see how flattering and pretty it is on her skin tones. And then the boys on the right, we have a couple other types of light. The boy on the top picture is my son, and that was at his Pinewood Derby when he was at one of his competitions when he was a Cub Scout. And that was like gymnasium light at a church, which is like the most horrible light there is. And you can see the little boy who's sitting right next to him, who's making the face. You can see when you have that overhead light, you've got lots of shadows on their faces, and the color is a little bit orangey and yellowy. It's just really not flattering at all. And then the picture of the boys on the bottom is at a local school that I shot for. And that light's a little bit more natural looking. It is still artificial light. So really, when you're going into a situation with artificial light, it could sort of run the gamut between really terrible looking artificial light to something that's a little bit more manageable. So Julie, let's take a second real quick. I see there's lots of things in the chat, so maybe we can talk about some of those goals and things like that real quick.
It looks like everyone has posted their, what they do and the what type of smartphone they are using.
Okay.
I don't see any questions or comments yet.
Okay.
So.
Well, if you see any, just stop me and we'll take a break. So
I surely will.
Make sure that we capture all of that. So, and then we can also talk about light in terms of the direction of light. So the light that's on me right now is considered side light, as is the picture on the screen. The light, obviously, in her case, is to the camera right hand side. So side light is a direction of light. When you're photographing a woman or a man for a portrait, oftentimes side light can be a little bit more realistic than flattering. Now, in her case, she's lovely and has she has young skin. But when we are talking about photographing, typically for photographing adults, I try to use flat light, which would mean that the light is facing the subject's face. And so as the photographer, my back would be to the light. That tends to be the most flattering for portraits because it's just the most forgiving. You don't see as many of the wrinkles and imperfections in their face. And then backlight was a light that we mentioned just a second ago in the picture of the girl who was hanging down from the tree. It's a beautiful way to shoot. It can be a little bit trickier when it comes to shooting backlight with our camera phones, and we'll talk about that in just a little bit. And then top-down light is another example of light. So that would be, for example, if we were to go outside right now, here in the middle of the day, the sun is right overhead, and that can also be a challenging direction of light when it comes to shooting people if they are camera aware, which means if they're looking straight at the camera, because that light is shining straight down. So you see lots of shadows from eyebrows or glasses or noses. However, top down light, like in the middle of the day right now outside, is super bright. And it's very forgiving when it comes to shooting action, because when we're shooting action, especially with our smartphones, we need to have a lot of light. So there's no good light or bad light when in terms of these directions. It's just helpful to know what they are best used for. And so, so here's some more examples of that. The family on the left is a backlit picture. So it's a little bit harder to see because the sun is through the trees. But this is an example of backlighting that would have been okay for me to use my smartphone on, because it is diffused by those tree branches. If the light had been shining straight through, then it would be much more difficult for my phone camera to take that picture. The little girl on the top right, that is an example of flat light. So in this situation, she is facing a window and my back is to the window. So the light on her face is it's facing her flat. So that's the term, flat light. And it's very flattering. Of course, she's a little girl, so she would look great in any light, but it tends to reduce the appearance of those fine lines and wrinkles, just like a great face cream. So, and then the family on the bottom. That would be an example of similar to the light that's outside right now. It's sort of the middle of the day, which isn't usually when I would choose to do a family shoot. Now they were having sort of a family event, so they hired me to come take pictures at the event. But for this situation, they were running around playing football, and it was perfect light for that because it was quick and it captures that action really well. And they weren't attempting to look at the camera, so I wasn't as concerned about what their faces looked like. So I'm going to go back real quick. Whoops, there we go. So in terms of business shooting, so I know I'm going to look through my list again just to remind myself what types of businesses we have. And Julie, if there's anybody on the list that weren't in the email that you sent me, just to it would be good to know if there are any other businesses represented that I'm not aware of. But mainly what I wanted to say in terms of that top-down light is that it's really great for capturing people who are involved in something. So as long as they're not camera aware and you're not trying to take a portrait of them, this type of light is fantastic. It can be a little bit challenging for product shots because it does still have that really harsh shadow line, which isn't something that you typically want to have on your product shots. And so we'll talk about products in a little bit, but product photography is also another workshop that we've done specifically. So that link that Julie sent, I put in the chat, somewhere around that same link, you'll be able to find a workshop that's specific to product photography. And we go into depth about dealing with light and creating light boxes in a really inexpensive, simple way. We talk about editing product photography. So if you're really interested in that, then that's a really super helpful workshop to look at too. So, so where to find the best light? Places that have open shade without bright light behind it are great. Open shade is a very flattering, soft, diffused type of light that I highly recommend trying out. The one caveat is that if you consider a tree with shade underneath the tree, if you are shooting, let's say your subject's here doing something underneath the tree and you're shooting through, then behind the tree, you'll see lots of really bright light where the tree's not having shade anymore. And that can be a real challenge for your camera phones. And so it can be a real challenge for any phone or any camera for that matter, because that light is so much brighter than the shade that's underneath the tree. But places like a porch on the front of a building are fantastic because you have the building behind to block any of that bright light, but you have the nice diffused light coming out from in front of the porch. Something similar to that are doors or garage doors. This picture on this screen is my daughter, and this was in our garage. And so garage doors are fantastic for product photography. They're great for portraits because when you are you'll park your subject, whether it's a product or a person, near the front of the garage, and the back of the garage tends to just sort of darken naturally when you're telling your camera to expose properly for your subject, which we'll talk about in a little bit further down. We'll talk about exposure and spot exposing using your camera, and all of this is sort of words that we haven't covered yet, but I promise we'll get back to that.
Hey, Nikki.
Yeah.
Gabby has a question that just keep it on your radar.
Okay.
I don't know if you actually addressed this topic, but she would like ideas on how to shoot pictures underwater. And she said she also has a GoPro camera. It does indoor and outdoor.
All right. Well, I will say that I am not a skilled underwater photographer, but the things that I do know about underwater photography, I've really only ever shot with my smartphone underwater because I don't have an waterproof case for my DSLR. So, however, I've just taken some fun pictures of my kids at the pool with my phone. I'm assuming the GoPro that you're talking about would be something that's a waterproof option for shooting under the water.
She is a swim instructor, so that's probably a lot of what she's.
No, that's awesome. because those are super fun. Those pictures are super fun. One thing that I learned when I was taking pictures of my kids is that editing is really important because the kids can tend to look sort of blue underwater, which makes sense. So pulling your pictures into something like Lightroom, which we talk about specifically in the editing workshop, will be really helpful. I would also encourage you to get as close as possible to your subjects underwater, because water really makes a huge difference in terms of focus and exposure, and it just can tend to look really blurry, even if the water's really clean. So I would encourage you to get as close as possible to the subjects underwater. So editing and really your proximity to the subjects are two of the things that I know are really helpful and important for underwater photography. So I'm excited to see pictures that you take, though. I would love for you to share them with us somehow, because that's super fun. The other thing that I think can be really cool is when you as the photographer are in the water and the kids are on the edge of the pool, and you sort of have your camera kind of halfway through. So like the water line is kind of halfway through your screen, and you can kind of see the kids outside the water and underneath the water. It makes it a little bit, in my opinion, a little bit more forgiving, the underwater portion of it. Like, let's say your GoPro isn't the clearest camera, doesn't have the sharpest focus. If you can also see the subject on top of the water, then what's underneath the water will just sort of feel really cool and novel, but you'll still have a clear out of water portion of your camera or picture, if that makes sense. I'm not sure if that makes sense or not, but I'm just sort of brainstorming, like if I was shooting with a GoPro underwater, how to kind of add some variety and maybe create some forgiveness in terms of the fact that those underwater pictures can be really challenging to get focus really well. So, but that's a fun question. I'm glad that you asked. So we were talking about doors and garage doors. Window light is another fantastic place to find light. And in most of our situations, as I'm looking through the list, we're going to be indoors for most of our shooting. And so you really utilizing that natural light at the windows will be really important. Oftentimes when I was first shooting, I was very adamant about only capturing, in terms of my family photography specifically, only capturing moments as they happened. So I was really reluctant to set anything up. I've since learned that that's silly and there's no reason to not set things up. So what I try to do is around my own house is set up rooms so that I can utilize the light the most effectively. And you can do the same thing in terms of the way that you're setting up your space at work. So you may have, we'll talk about this in a second, about becoming a student of the light in your space. But when you are in your space all the time, which you are typically as a small business owner, start to pay attention to when the light is really nice in certain areas of your space. And when I say nice, what I mean is diffused and soft. So right now, the room that I'm sitting in is a south-facing window. And especially in the winter time, with the sun being lower on the horizon, I get a ton of really direct kind of beaming light in here. And that's not what you're looking for. What you really want is the light where if you looked at the ground and you put your hand over the floor, you wouldn't see a harsh shadow line. You would just see like a really soft diffused line between the shade, the shadow, and the light. That's going to provide the easiest light to take pictures in and the most flattering overall, generally speaking, if you had to choose. So we'll talk a little bit about that harsh light and how it can be kind of fun to play around with. But if you're looking for something really simple, that diffused soft light is really the best thing to look for. And then cloudy days are another fantastic option. So many times I have families who I'm shooting who will say, I'm worried about Saturday because it's going to be cloudy. And as a photographer, I'm like, that's fantastic, because cloudy days are sort of like a giant light box. So a light box is basically a box that you can create or build yourself, where you are creating a whole bunch of diffused light, like we just talked about. And in cloudy day, that's really what that is. That's the clouds have created that diffusion of the light, and it is fantastic. So I mentioned this 360 test because the sun still is in a certain spot in the sky, even if you can't necessarily pinpoint exactly where it is. So I often have people practice with a subject, just having that subject spin all the way around in a circle and taking a picture sort of like 4 or 5 times around the circle. And you can see how the light changes and how it's more flattering in certain spots, even on those cloudy days. So just a fun little thing to play around with. Okay, so how to work with difficult light. I'm just going to check the time. So mixed light is a challenge for everybody. So what mixed light means is you have 2 different temperatures of light. And the temperature of the light, like I mentioned just a second ago, incandescent light bulbs, like the one behind me, those tend to have a really warm kind of orangey glow to them. Overhead fluorescent lights will have sort of a greenish color. And then that natural light's real clear and flattering. And so mixed light would be any mixture of those different types of light. And what that can do is that it ends up making one of those different types of light look even more colored than it would have if it was only shot in that type of light. That's a long sentence, but I'll try to show you an example. So the kids in this picture are from a school that I shot at, and the light coming in the window, of course, is natural light. And then they have like an overhead, not fluorescent light, the word is blanking out of my brain right now, but another type of overhead classroom, typical classroom type of light. And if you look at their skin tones, you can see that they look a little bit orangey. But if you look at the window, you can see that light actually looks a little bit blue, which is what happens to natural light when you have indoor light turned on. The natural light ends up looking blue. So what I recommend when you have this mixed light, if you can't avoid it, is to have your subjects engaged in something as opposed to looking at the camera, because it just becomes less important that their skin tones are the right color when they are engaged in an activity. The best way to deal with mixed light is to turn off those inside lights. So when I go into a shoot, people will always start turning all the lights on, and I go behind them and turn all the lights off, and I work around the natural light that's in the space. And now that's not always possible, because sometimes the room doesn't have natural light. Maybe it's an indoor room in your building space, or maybe the light's just really not enough and you really need more light in order to capture an activity that can't be moved over to the window. But if at all possible, I try to turn off indoor lights and just use the natural light. So dappled light, an example of that would be shooting underneath a tree where you have some bright pockets of light and some dark pockets of shadows. And that's a similar fix where I try to get my subjects engaged in each other or in an activity. So if I'm shooting a family and we're underneath a tree, I'm not going to have them look at me typically, because I'm going to see patches of bright on some of their faces and shadows on some of their faces. I'll have them look all at each other, or be engaged in an activity, that sort of a thing. That hard streaming light we're going to talk a little bit more about in just a second. And then that overhead light or midday sunlight is a similar type of fix where I try to get people engaged in things. And you hear me say that a lot because that's really the type of shooting that I do. I love to shoot moments of, clients talking to customer or employees talking to customers, people, at a restaurant, your diners engaged with each other instead of turning and looking at the camera. Just because I think that authenticity of those moments really helps to tell the story of your product more, in most cases, than a camera aware subject who is looking at the camera and smiling. That's sort of my MO, whether I'm shooting families or newborns or businesses or nonprofits. I try to learn about their story enough that I can really sort of step into their world and just try to shoot as naturally as possible. So we talked a little about that hard streaming light. And And so we can kind of trick our camera into using that light and making it kind of a dramatic shot. So here are some examples of that. These are all little pockets of light, whether they're natural light, like the ones by the windows, or artificial light, like the iPad that's in the upper right-hand corner. I'm pointing to my screen like you can see my screen. So what we'll do is we'll talk about that in a little bit when we get more to the camera settings. But we can kind of trick our camera into dealing with that light in a way that just sort of gives you a little bit more variety in your gallery. So you have some like drama. It can be really challenging if you don't know how to deal with it, because what it can do is, instead of looking like pretty fun dramatic light, it can actually end up sort of blowing out, which means it's so bright you can't see any detail in the picture anymore because that light was so bright. So we'll sort of trick our cameras in a little bit and talk about that. So like I mentioned a second ago, I really encourage people to become a student of light in your space. So really spend some time intentionally looking for pleasing light at different times of the day in different seasons of the year, which is also really important. We recently moved into, well, I say recently, it was last year, into our new house. And when you walk into my living room, I have an entire wall of windows, and it's literally what sold me on the house. I was like, I don't even need to see the rest of the house. We'll just buy it because of this room. It's a south-facing wall, which if I had the ability to turn my house around so that those windows face north, I would do that. Because in the winter time, so from season to season, it changes. The sun is lower in the sky, and it just beams into our beautiful windows. And it's beautiful, and it's still super bright and lovely, but it's a whole different kind of light, and it can be almost kind of blinding. So I've learned that about my house over the course of this year, is that in the summertime, when the sun is more overhead, there's less of that beaming, direct, hard light in my living room. Now, what I said before is if I could turn my house around and have those windows on the north side, I would, because in the northern hemisphere, the sun is never going to be low in the sky on the north side. So there's never any sharp, harsh light through your north facing windows. So that's a lot of technical stuff, but it is important when you think about shooting in your space. Oftentimes when I have a new client through the center, or a family client, or anybody else, and they ask me what time we should shoot, if we're going to be shooting inside, I ask questions like, well, do you want to shoot in your space, and what direction are those windows facing? Because if I've never been there, I can't see for myself. But if I know that you have, west facing windows at the front of your building, and you want to shoot in the afternoon, that's going to be challenging because the sun's going to be going down, and the sun's going to be beaming through those windows. So with those west facing windows, I'll recommend a morning shoot, so we have that soft diffused light. So really, what that really means practically is, spend a day, set an alarm on your phone. Every hour, walk through your space and take notes. In the morning, this part of the dining room looks beautiful because the light's really soft and pretty. In the afternoon, it's terrible there because the light's really bright and blinding. But in the afternoon, in the kitchen, this little tiny little tiny window that we have, the light's really pretty and different. So that way you can, in a more practical way, plan your shooting so that I want to try to capture some diners sitting here for breakfast. So I'm gonna ask some people to sit over here on this table, tomorrow morning, and really try to capture some shots then. That sort of a thing. So the light is that important, that some investment of time to really become a student of the light in your space, I think, can be really helpful. So, okay, so moving on, do we have any more questions, Julie? I see some chats up there. I just can't get to them very easily, so.
I don't see any recent ones.
Okay, great. All right, so then we'll move on to elements of composition. I'm just going to make sure that I didn't leave anything off. Okay, so the next screen is going to feel a little overwhelming, but I promise it won't be. That's a lot of stuff, but we're going to go through it as fast as we can. So like I mentioned before, elements of composition are not unique to photography. These elements of composition are used in all different types of art forms. And the point of them really is to grab your viewer's eyes and point them at what you want them to see. So as opposed to just taking a quick snapshot of a scene that, may be fine and maybe you wanted to capture that moment, if you are able to take a second and really think through what's happening in the scene itself and how can you use the natural elements of this scene to compose your photograph in a way that will really grab your viewer's attention. And like I mentioned before, really slow their scroll as they're scrolling through their feed haphazardly, and have them take an extra half a second to look at your social media posts. So one of the most basic elements of composition is the rule of thirds. And so what that means is on both of these pictures, if you were to lay over the top of it a tic-tac-toe grid, you would see that my main subjects are at the corners of that inside square. So Mayor, I just have totally blanked on his face, Lionel, who I cannot think of his last name, the mayor of Fayetteville, is here at the library in the picture on the bottom. And if I were to lay a tic-tac-toe grid over the entire image, you would see that his face is in the upper left-hand corner of that middle square. And that has been proven naturally. That's where our eyes go when we look at a photograph. And so if you see the one on the upper right-hand corner, this family that has just been, this husband just came home from being deployed, you'll see the little boy is his picture or his face is in the lower right-hand corner of that inside square. So basically, if you are in a situation where you can place your main subject somewhere along those four corners of that inside square, that's where your viewer's eyes are naturally going to look first. So another element of composition, and again, these are all just tools. They're not rules. They're not things that you have to do. And you surely and certainly can't do all of them in one picture because they sort of cancel each other out sometimes. But if you know some of them and kind of have them in the back of your mind, you can look at the scene and see which ones might be applicable and work best for that situation. So symmetry is another element of composition that can be pleasing to your viewer's eyes. In the picture on the left, of course, her body, if you split it straight down the middle, it would be almost symmetrical on both sides. And you also see some leading lines, her arms, which we'll talk about in just a second. And then on the right, we were walking down the grocery aisle. And so it provided that symmetry on both sides while he was learning how to read and was reading our grocery list for the first time. So the symmetry of the aisles of the grocery store helped to sort of guide the viewer's eyes right to his face. So balance and negative space are also something that is nice to think about when you are composing your photographs. These pictures both have a lot of negative space, which is basically the space that's opposite your main subject. So he's following a little path there on the left in the tall grasses. And on the right-hand side, even though there's still some things happening in the picture that provide balance, most of that is sort of soothing and restful for your eyes. And so it really helps to draw your viewer's eyes to your main subject. And the same at the top, she's jumping in this big active picture. And on the left, there are some little mountains in the background that help provide the balance. But for the most part, that's really sort of written off as negative space in your viewer's eyes. So this can sometimes be something that you can just see naturally as an option in the scene that you're about to photograph. So leading lines are another thing that are fantastic to look for in the scene or in the environment in which you're shooting. So of course we see that the leading lines coming through on the left picture, and then the sidewalk leading our eyes right to the little boy who's about to be reunited with his dad. So depth is something else that's really fun to play around with, and what that means is even in a 2D picture, we can move ourselves as the photographers, or sort of help set up the scene so that there is depth within the picture. So there's something happening in the foreground, there's something happening in the midground, and there's something happening in the background. And like in the picture on the left at the school, We see some kids who are out of focus in the foreground, and then the teacher, who's the main subject of this photograph, she's in focus, she's sort of in the middle ground, and then the background is the rest of the classroom. And something similar in the other picture, we've got, he's playing on the floor doing his work, she's sitting at the desk doing her work in the middle of the space, and then she's way back at the whiteboard in the background also doing her work. So it just helps to create interest and sort of a more of a dynamic feel to photographs when you can kind of add that depth. So framing is another really fun technique to play around with, and you can almost always find options on framing in the natural environment that you're shooting. So whether, like in the picture on the left, this is my daughter, we were headed to a taekwondo competition. It was her very first one, so she was very nervous, as you can tell. And I was sitting in the front seat, and I turned around and she was just framed perfectly in between my other two kids in their car seats. And then in the other picture, it was a vow renewal, and the doorways are perfect framing options for that sort of a thing. Window frames, arches, any sort of a thing. You can see those when you really start paying attention. You'll see options to provide framing for your photographs all over the place. So, and then perspective and details. Perspective is something I love to play around with as the photographer. And what that means to me is basically just moving my body as the photographer in a way that's going to help tell the story in a different way. So like the picture on the left, I decided to shoot over the top of them so that we could see the leaves, we could see them holding hands, we could see like the tattoo down her leg, all sorts of things. And he was holding the leaf in his hand. If I had shot that, and I did shoot it from other perspectives also, it just tells a different story. So I love to move around as much as I can as the photographer to help tell the story in a different way. So I'm changing my own perspective. It can also be really helpful when it comes to shooting in a challenging space. So let's say you are, I'm looking at my list to try to come up with some examples that I could think of. Let's say you're in the therapy clinic, and there are lots of people in the background who are not supposed to be photographed, who, you don't have permission to photograph. That would be a situation where changing your own perspective as the photographer would be, not only could you tell the story in a different way, but you could also get a picture when you couldn't, if you were shooting through your subjects and capturing all the people in the background that you don't have permission to post about, if that makes sense. So you can shoot over the top of them. You could get down low and shoot up at them so that their background then becomes sort of the ceiling or the top of the wall. So not only does it help tell your story in a different way and give you variety in your gallery, but it can also help you take a picture when you otherwise may not be able to grab the shot because of extenuating circumstances in the environment. So, and then details. I love shooting details, like people holding hands when you can't even see their faces, or the ingredients to a meal that you're about to serve, or the toys in the therapy room without kids in the picture. It could be things like the weights, like set up the weights in like a cool space without people in them. Because I think those detail pictures help tell your story in a way that doesn't require specific types of social media posts. So what I mean by that is that it's really great to have lots of detailed pictures in your portfolio, in your phone, so that if you have a post that you really want to post about, but there doesn't seem to be a picture that would make total sense to go along with the post, oftentimes those detail pictures can come in really handy in those situations because they aren't begging to have a story told about them, if that makes sense. So whether it's, a pile of therapy toys, or a pile of weights, or a flowery surface with some ingredients, or like cookie cutters or whatever, having those types of pictures in your portfolio can be really helpful when you need to post about something, but you don't have a picture to go along with it, if that makes sense. So, and then scale is something else that's really fun to play around with, whether it's really like making a child who's working really hard in therapy look huge because he's such a superhero, or maybe it's a little tiny kid in the pool with their helper and you're shooting over the top of them in the pool. So they look even tinier because you're using a wide screen on your camera. And it just kind of helps. Maybe it's a baby and you're doing baby swimming lessons. And so that can really help accentuate the smallness factor of the child. So yeah, playing around with scale, I think, is another way, and it adds variety. We really want to add that variety so that when you're scrolling through your social media feed or your website, all of your pictures aren't taken from the same position of you standing, at 5'6" tall and shooting in that little area of space. We want to try to change it up and really add that variety. So isolating our main subject, that's something that we all try to do. We don't want to have just a bunch of snapshots, which I think is sort of what happens when you're not trying to intentionally take pictures. And I have plenty of snapshots on my phone, like 15,000 of them, embarrassingly. But I think that when we are using intention in our photography, that's what changes it from a snapshot really to a photograph. And so we can use light to isolate our subject. So in the picture on the right, there was light coming in the window and everything behind her was pretty dark. And so that light really helped to isolate her, as well as the picture on the left at the bar studio. She was the closest one to the light and everybody else sort of naturally got a little bit darker, as well as a little bit blurred out, which we'll talk about when we talk about camera settings in just a minute. So she's nice, crisp focus, and everybody behind her is just slightly blurred and a little bit darker. Color can also be a great way to isolate your main subject when you have that amount of control over the scene. Sometimes we don't. Sometimes we're just shooting, what we're seeing, which is great too. But when you do have that amount of control, color can be a great way to isolate your main subject. And then another composition technique that I recommend is when you are shooting movement, to allow for space for the movement to occur. So in this picture, you can see the kids who are stacking cups in their gym class, and they are all on the right-hand side of the photograph. And you can tell that you can see a couple of the kids who've already started running, and I left space intentionally in the frame for them to run across so that our eyes as the viewers can visually sort of follow them running across. It would be a completely different picture if they were all as a group on the left-hand side of the photograph, running off the picture. So if you have a business where you are shooting action, it's nice to keep that in mind, to really allow there to be space for your viewers' eyes to sort of anticipate where the subjects are going. And it also allows for a feeling of some of that negative space. So microcomposition is a technique that I learned about from one of my favorite photographers. His name is Sam Abel, and he is a National Geographic photographer. So microcomposition basically means that you as a photographer have positioned yourself in a space where the light is pleasing, the background is pleasing. So whatever's going to be in the background of your photograph is pleasing, and you are just waiting for your subject to do something interesting. So that may sound like it would take forever. And I actually have an interesting video that if we have time, which we probably won't, but I'm hoping that we do, because it's so neat to hear him talk about the concept of microcomposition. And to me, it's just a super inspiring reminder that even a National Geographic, highly acclaimed National Geographic photographer, still it's something that he has to actively think about. So practically speaking, as business owners, what that means is knowing your space well enough to know when I stand here and the window is on my left-hand side, I have a really pretty view of my kitchen, or I have a really pretty view of my retail space. And so on a busy day, when I have lots of customers in, I'm going to stand over here with that light to my left with that pretty view behind them and just wait for them to do something interesting. And maybe that's 5 minutes. I mean, it doesn't have to be long. But that micro composition is what you're doing. You're composing it. It's sort of in real time and just allowing for the natural activity to take place. And so what I have found in shooting lots of families and lots of clients is that humans tend to be repetitive. We tend to do the same thing. And so you'll see when you start paying attention, and maybe you already have noticed that your customers or your clients that you're working with, are going to tend to do the same things, whether they are coming to the counter to order something at the bakery and then they go have a seat, or they come in and check their kids in for swim lessons and then they go sit down and the kids go. So you know the movements of where your customers are going to be. So you can then place yourself in a spot that's going to capture them in the most pleasing way that you can. So that's really a lot of words for that, but it's a really cool technique when you play around with it, if you have some time to really think through that. So then we'll talk just really briefly about shot types. And the reason I mention this is because to me, it's helpful to think through this when you are trying to put together that gallery that is interesting and dynamic and varied. Because like I mentioned, we don't want the same picture at 5'6" off the ground for your entire social media feed. If you step back and you get that wide angle shot of your retail space or your pool area, or maybe the bakery kitchen, that sort of a thing, then those sorts of establishing setting pictures can be really neat for your customers to see. A full shot would be your subject or your whatever it is that you're shooting. The entire body or the entire form is shown and it fills your whole screen. A partial shot would be like a medium shot. And then those close-up shots, like I mentioned before, hands, details of the scenes, people working in the kitchen, therapists working with children, and you don't even see anybody's faces. Those types of detail shots, I think, really can bring your customers in and sort of make them feel like they're there. And they're also really helpful and flexible to have for social media posts. So storytelling in photography. I love asking myself some of these questions when I'm going into a shoot. I think through what the customer's story is and what the message is and how can our time together communicate that story. So when I'm thinking through these questions, I'm thinking through it in terms of, I'm going to be there for a couple hours. What are we setting up during our shoot so that I can help tell their story as well as I can in my 2 hours of being there? Now you have a much broader perspective when you're thinking about these questions because you have all the days, all the hours to take your pictures. But you can still sort of really think through these questions specifically and concretely, and maybe even write them down. Like, what am I trying to capture in these pictures that I'm taking on this day? Who is my main subject, or what is my main subject? Do I have a new therapy technique that I really want to capture during these pictures? Or is there a new product that we're launching that I really want to capture? Or did we just complete a big project on this big house that I want to really be able to tell the story of this new project that we have completed? And then what are the best shot types to tell that story? Like we talked about just a second ago, these 4 different shot types, or maybe there are specific shot types that you don't see here that would really help tell the story of that scene in your mind. Write them down, make notes. Before I go to shoots, if I'm shooting a family, I make notes about how many kids they have, how old their kids are, what sorts of things I think would help tell the story of connection of the family. And before I go to shoot a business client, we have a conversation before the shoot and we talk about these types of things. I don't ask them what shot types they would tell the story, but we do talk about what they're trying to communicate to their customers and how, as the photographer, we could show that visually. And so, and I make a shot list. I go into all of my business client shoots with literally a typed out shot list. We want to make sure that we capture all of these things. And then of course, anything else that comes up, we take pictures of too, but it's just really helpful to have that intention behind the shoot. So, and then asking yourself specifically, where should my body be in this, when I'm trying to tell this story? Where's the light going to be? What perspective do I want to use? What's the background going to look like? Really think through the things that we've talked about specifically, and it'll feel more second nature over time. In the beginning, it'll feel like just tons of information, but the more that you do it and the more intentional you are about practicing, the easier and the more second nature it'll become. So this is what we were talking about. And I actually we started at 12. So I think we actually do have a second. I'm going to try to see if I can figure out how to. That's not it. Sorry, I'm looking for my. Julie, I'm afraid I've just gotten myself in the weeds here. Okay.
I'm sorry, what?
Oh, I there we go. Sorry, I thought that I had. I'm trying to share something else on my screen, but I'm not seeing it as an option. Okay, I'll try again at the end, but if we still have time at the end, we'll.
Also, if it's something you can just screenshot, send it to me, maybe I can put it up.
It's actually a video. It's like a 3-minute
Okay.
long video of him talking about this concept, but we'll go back to it at the end and I'll try again.
Okay, great.
Remember, I said it would not be graceful of me trying to get from screen to screen. So
Hey, it's
okay.
doing well.
So like I mentioned, I just encourage you to really practice intentionally. One of the things that that I recommend is, we had that huge long list of elements of composition, and that's overwhelming to think about trying to do all of those things. So what I often encourage people, and I think I actually have a slide about this later, but I'm going to go ahead and talk about it now because it's on my mind, is to choose one element of composition, let's say framing, and then choose one message that you're trying to deliver to your customers, and try to pair those two things together. So think to yourself, I really want to, deliver the message of innovation. We have this new product coming out, and it's very innovative. So I really want to try to capture the idea of innovation in this new product, and I'm going to use framing to do that. And then take like 10 minutes to try to do that. And if you can end up with one picture that uses framing and delivers that message of innovation that you can put into your portfolio, then that's fantastic. And so what I encourage business owners to do is to sort of pair an element of composition with a message that you're trying to get across in a way that way, and take 10 minutes. And if you don't get a picture that you want to keep, that's okay. It was only 10 minutes. But if you do, then that's fantastic. And you can put that in your portfolio to have handy for those social media or website posts or that sort of blog post, that sort of a thing. I think that type of intentional practice can really make a big difference in your photography. Okay, so moving on, we're going to move on and talk a little bit about smartphone specific considerations. Now, I don't, for a second, want anybody to think that I know how to work all of the smartphone cameras, because that would be my teenage daughter who's not here today. And she has that teenager brain that can, like, 30 times faster than I can find things on my phone. But most of the cameras on our smartphones are pretty similar. They're similar enough that we can talk about basic topics within them. And then you may just have to do a little bit of digging to find exactly what that's called on your phone. Whereas on my phone, it may be called, one thing. On your phone, it may be called something different. But for the most part, the smartphone cameras are similar enough that we can sort of have a general conversation about them. So, so some of the things that we'll talk about in this part of the conversation are camera apps, exposure and focus, the challenges and strengths of the smartphone cameras, flash and zoom, which will be really fast because I don't recommend either one, and then how to manage the tricky light situations. And we'll talk a little bit about editing on our smartphones. So first of all, the reason that we're talking, I should probably back up a little bit. The reason that we're even talking about smartphone photography instead of DSLR photography is because I really think that smartphone cameras are a better investment for small business owners than buying a new digital camera for lots of reasons. One of the reasons is because the newer smartphones have fantastic cameras. And they're just really good, and they're powerful, and they have lots of settings that are super helpful, and can take really great pictures. Number two, they're easier to use than a digital camera if you are attempting to use your digital camera in a way that actually makes it worth having a camera, which is shooting in manual and using all of the bells and whistles. If you're shooting with a fancy digital camera in auto, you're missing out on lots of stuff that's fantastic. And I mean, I have multiple of them and use them for all of my work, but I don't think they're necessary for the types of photography that small business owners typically need. And I say this as somebody who's hired by small businesses to come in and take pictures. So, I'm telling the truth because I'm talking you out of hiring me. But no, for I really do think that the cameras are fantastic. They're easier to use. They also will simplify your workflow. Whereas if you are using a digital camera and you take all your pictures that we're talking about taking today with your digital camera, then they're on the camera and they're on a memory card that you have to then put on your computer in order to download off of your camera onto your computer. You're probably going to want to edit them, so you're going to edit them in some software on your computer. And now they're on your computer, and you can't post on Instagram on your computer. So now you have to get them back onto your phone. So that's a really bumpy workflow. That is a lot of work. But when you shoot with your smartphone camera, it's on your phone. You can edit using that Lightroom Mobile app that I mentioned. And then it's right there. And you have all of your cameras or all of your pictures organized really well, because you'll do as I say, not as I do, because mine are not organized well, but yours will be, because it really helps to simplify that workflow. And then you have all these edited pictures in these albums of different types of pictures that are relevant to your business, and they're efficiently used for in social media or blogging or that sort of thing. So moving on. So we've established that we're going to use our smartphones. So what camera should we use? Should we use the native camera that comes in our phone or a camera app? And I kind of have different opinions about this. A lot of it depends on how old your phone is. If you have an older phone with an older camera, then the camera apps are going to offer some more flexibility than your camera that comes with your phone will have. However, they're also harder to get to because they're not as quick to access on your phone than the native camera or the native camera that comes with your phone. I feel like I'm using the words phone and camera interchangeably, so I'm having to think through what word I'm using. So all that to say, I think it's a great investment for small business owners to have a newer phone that has a newer camera, because they are fast and they're powerful and they have lots of settings that older phone cameras don't have. So, however, Camera Plus is an app for older phones that has more options than an older phone's native camera would have. So we're going to talk a little bit about exposure on our smartphones. So exposure is a photography word that we use a lot. That's super important. And it basically what it is it's the play between three different functions or settings on your camera: aperture, shutter speed, and ISO. So aperture, if we think about the blurriness of our background, that is what aperture has to do with. It has to do with a lot more than that, but that's the most simple way of describing it. And so on a manual DSLR camera, those three functions, the aperture, shutter speed, and ISO, sort of play together to create the exposure, which is basically telling your camera how bright or dark to make the scene. Now on your phone cameras, that's not as delineated, so you're not going to have as much. You can have the power over those three things, but it takes a long time to be able to access those, and those would be like in the camera apps. But in a camera app, you can change your shutter speed and change your ISO and change your aperture manually, and it would just take a really long time. I don't think that's necessary. I think that your camera, with a little bit of playing around on its sort of auto setting on your phone, can manage exposure well enough. So camera sensors, what the camera sensor is basically the camera is going to look at your scene overall, and it's going to decide how bright or how dark to capture the photograph. That typically works fine. However, in some special situations, it doesn't. So I'm gonna attempt again to switch over to something else and we'll see if it works, so that I can show you my camera. On my phone. Okay, so I think it's gonna work. All right, so I'm assuming everybody can see my screen now. And there's the other side of my office, also my gym. So I am going to move around just a little bit. Julie, can you still hear me?
Hi, Nikki. Sorry. Yes, I apologize. I can hear you. I just couldn't find my unmute button.
Oh, no, that's okay. I just wanted to make sure. So
Yeah.
I'm going to move around just a little bit. And so what you're seeing, you can see my whole screen. When I talk about spot exposing, so basically what my camera is doing is it's looking at this scene with this really bright window and these harsh shadows that are down here by the weight bench. And it's saying, man, there's a lot of light coming in at this window. So I am going to make this area that's down here darker so that this space here by the window is exposed properly. So it looks natural. So what I can do is what if I was in a situation where I really wanted to be able to see something that was down here, which would be strange, but if you, in this situation, if I really wanted something down here to be brighter, then you can spot expose, which means that you tap your screen in that space that's darker, and it automatically changes the exposure of the whole scene. So I'm going to go back up here. So you can see when I tap the window, it makes it darker underneath the weight bench. But when I tap the weight bench, it makes it brighter underneath the weight bench, which makes it brighter everywhere else. So that's a way of telling your camera, this is what I want to be exposed properly, and everything else can either get brighter or darker accordingly, if that makes sense. So it can be helpful in terms of, because when you don't do that, your camera is just going to decide how bright or how dark every space in the scene is going to be. So it gives you a little touch of a manual operation when you're able to do that. So you can just play around by touching. If you touch a bright area in the scene, it's going to make all the shadows darker. If you touch a shadow area of the scene, it's going to make everything really bright. Now you notice it really brightened up like the surface of the weight bench. But if I tap that space, it's going to change it also. So this is what we would call spot exposing, more or less using a camera. I mean, using a smartphone camera. So it can give you a little bit more of a, power over that, over the exposure on your screen. So the other thing to think about, there's something that is called autofocus and auto exposure lock. So if we are still here at the screen and instead of just tapping, I'm going to tap it and hold my finger down. And at the top, you can see that a little yellow block came on that says AEAF lock. So now my exposure is locked. So no matter where I move, my camera, it's not changing the exposure. But if I take that off, like I just have to tap the screen somewhere else and it takes that off, then when I move my camera, it's changing the exposure. Does that make sense? So locking that exposure can be helpful in certain situations where you want the exposure to stay the same. If you're like moving around a space and you really want the exposure to stay the same no matter where you move your camera, as opposed to it deciding for you how it's going to expose. So that's just a way of giving you a little bit more power over your camera. So I'm just looking through my notes because now I don't have my I don't have my PowerPoint in front of me. So another mode on our cameras that we may see pop up is called night mode. And I'm going to show you briefly what that looks like. So if I go into this hallway, the pictures that don't need to be behind my office, you can see, I don't know if you can hear me anymore, but you can see the yellow at the top pop on, and it says 1 second. And that is night mode, and it comes on automatically if you are in a dark situation. That can be something that's helpful. I'm going to try to go back to my PowerPoint here. So that night mode can be something that is helpful if you find yourself in a setting that's darker. It could be a restaurant in the evening. It could be the kitchen, maybe could be darker. Oftentimes restaurant kitchens are a little darker. It could be the bakery first thing in the morning before everybody gets there, and it's 4 a.m. or whatever horrible time the people who own bakeries show up at work, 3 a.m. I don't even know, it's so early. So those types of settings are super dark. And so what your camera will do is it'll pop on that little yellow oval that will say 1S or 2S or 3S, and that is night mode. And what that means is that if you take a picture right now with this mode on, you have to hold your camera completely still in order for there not to be blur, because it's holding the shutter open for that long. So you really have to sort of figure out a way to keep your arms completely still. So you could like prop them on a countertop, or sometimes I just sort of use my sides and sort of hold my camera as still as I can. So if you want to use that night function, you just have to keep that in mind. It's also not good for any sort of action, because any kind of action is going to look blurry, but it can be helpful in those types of situations where you're in a dark when you're in a dark setting and you want to kind of capture the real feeling of the situation, as opposed to introducing artificial light, like turning the lights on or using flash or something like that. That would make it feel completely different than it actually felt in real life. So I tend to prefer the feeling of knowing like what it felt like. I want to, what did it feel like when you got to work at 2 a.m. to start making the bread dough? It was, it was dark in the space, or it was a little bit moody because there was a little bit of light turned on in the kitchen, and just having like feeling the reality of what that looks like, I think to me is really, as a viewer, really interesting and fun. So now that I have my screen back on, I can see if I have forgotten anything. So another setting that you'll see on your smartphone cameras is Hdr mode, which stands for high dynamic range. And that is a mode that used to be really strange. You can turn it off, which is what I have mine on. I have mine off, not on. And it used to be really clunky and looked really strange. And what that means, what's happening when your camera does that, is that your camera has a certain dynamic range, which means that it is able to capture really bright highlights and really dark shadows without losing information up to a certain boundary. And beyond that, really, really bright shadows or highlights and really, really dark shadows won't be picked up within your camera. So it'll look like blown out or total blackness. So within that boundary, it can do it. But on a smartphone camera, it's usually a pretty small boundary, and anything outside of what it can do ends up looking blown out or totally black. So when you have HDR mode on, it takes two pictures. It takes one where it captures brighter highlights, and then it takes one where it captures darker shadows, and it blends it together. The newer, the smart HDR modes look better than the older ones did, but I still don't love any of them. So it's just something to keep in mind. You may love the look of it, and you may be in a situation. I know that we had somebody who installs solar panels sign up for the, I don't know if you're here yet or whether you made it or not, because I can't see the chat, but that may be a situation where having that HDR mode on would be helpful, because I anticipate that you would be shooting outside in really bright situations, but you may also have really dark, shadowy sides of houses or like roof lines that it would be helpful to be able to capture some pretty sky and still some detail in the dark side of a roof line. And that HDR mode may be helpful in that situation, because otherwise what would happen in that real life situation is that you may be able to capture the details of the solar panels, but then your sky is just going to be white. There's not going to be any information there because it's too bright. So that's something to play around with. If you work in a setting where that might be helpful, play around with it and see if you like it. I didn't show you the exposure slider function when I had my camera on, but basically when I had the screen shown and I was tapping around doing the spot exposing, there's a little sun right next to it, and that sun is a slider. So you can move the sun up and down, and it either increases exposure or decreases exposure. So it'll make your whole scene brighter or your whole scene darker. And that's something that is fantastic. And again, it just allows you a little bit more manual control over your camera. So play around with that. Again, it's really just tapping the screen to open up that exposure square that has a little sun next to it. And then you can slide that up and down to change your exposure. All right, so focusing on smartphones. We're going to talk a little bit about the portrait mode on your camera, on your smartphone cameras. And it may be called something different on Android cameras, I can't remember. And older camera phones, phone cameras, see, I use those words interchangeably. Older phone cameras do not have portrait mode. However, it's something that you can play around with some apps if your phone is too old to have portrait mode. But what that basically means is it's allowing you to have some of the feeling of creating that blurry background. So like in this picture here, you can see her eyes are in focus, but as you look down her body and at the blanket in her lap, that's out of focus. So depth of field is basically you telling your camera, I want to have this much of the scene in focus, and everything else I want it to get gradually out of focus. Or I want to have this much in focus, or I want to have everything in focus, or just a tiny little bit. So I think about it in terms of, like, if I had a really thick encyclopedia and I decided I only want pages, 37 through 125 to be in focus, and everything on this side of it to be out of focus and everything on that side of it to be out of focus. Your depth of field is just deciding how many pages in your book are going to be in focus, if that makes sense. So we can play around with that, and we can approximate that feel by using the portrait mode in the camera. I say approximate because it is kind of wonky, and it has some weirdness about it, but basically I may have to just go back to my camera so that I can show you. So when we talk about aperture or depth, we also talk about f-stop. So that's basically, those two terms are sort of interchangeable. So the aperture on the left would be an f-stop of 2. And you can see she's in focus and everything behind her gets more and more and more out of focus the further away from her you get. The picture on the right is an aperture of f22. So in this situation, she's in focus, the grass is in focus, the trees are in focus that are right behind her. Really, the only thing that's not in focus is the mountain that's in the really far background. And when you open up portrait mode in your camera, I'm probably going to just go ahead and do that so that I can show you. Okay, so when we open up portrait mode in our camera, all I did here at the bottom, you have the photo mode. I guess we could also talk about real quick. So photo mode, this is just one time. So this is just the regular view. And then if I tap that, it gives me the wide angle view. I don't, unless you're being really intentional and sort of going for a distortion feel, the wide angle mode, in my opinion, is a little bit much. But you can actually, specify how wide angle you want it to be, everything from 1/2 to 1. And then if you can, you can zoom in further just by pinching and pulling apart the screen. But if we go back to portrait mode, when we're in portrait mode, at the top of the screen, there's an F with a circle around it, and that is your aperture options. So if you tap the F, at the bottom, you will see a scrolling wheel. And it allows, on my camera, it allows everything from f16 to f1.4. So again, if we think back to those pictures of the girl in the tree, or with the tree, the smaller your F number, the smaller the little tiny sliver of, the smaller the little tiny sliver of focus is going to be. So f1.4, you're just going to have a teeny tiny little bit of your scene in focus. But at f16, you're going to have much more of your scene in focus. So I'm going to show you an example. So I'm at f1.4 right now. And so if we look at my coffee mug, you can see that only the very front of my coffee mug is in focus. So much so that the handle is out of focus, the back lip of the coffee cup is out of focus, the water cup right next to it is out of focus. But if I swing this across the bottom, you see the numbers are getting bigger, then almost the whole scene is in focus. The couch behind is still a little bit out of focus. So you can play around with that and sort of use that to your advantage. It's just another way of making your phone camera feel a little bit more manual and give you some more control over it. Now the caveat here, what it does is it defaults to f2.8. So that's where it will come on whenever you open up your camera. The caveat here is that when you are at a really shallow depth of field, it looks really fake. It doesn't look real. It looks, and you can see, like whenever I move it around at the top of the cup, you can see that the blanket that's behind it is trying to bounce into focus, and you can kind of see the same thing around the handle because it just doesn't know exactly how to do it. I mean, it's just a weakness in the camera technology. So I recommend not going too far down on your f-stop numbers. The 2.8, in my opinion, is really a good spot to stay, unless you're trying to get a little bit more in focus, and then you can go, of course, go higher than that. But I typically, on my phone camera, don't go any smaller on my aperture than 2.8, just because it can look really strange. So let's see here. All right. Just going to check the time real quick. So I mentioned briefly zoom and flash on our smartphone cameras, and I strongly recommend that you don't do either because specifically, so when we talk about zooming with our smartphone cameras, as soon as you zoom a tiny bit, it immediately degrades the image quality of your picture. So it's never going to be as sharp. It's never going to be as clear. And if you were to try to print it, it's not going to look as good as if you hadn't zoomed. So I recommend zooming with your feet. And actually, that's what I do even with my DSLR. I have multiple lenses that I shoot with, and all but one of them is a prime lens, which means it doesn't zoom. So I have to move. If I want to get closer to my client or my subject, I have to move with my feet. I have one zoom lens that I use for events in case there's a situation that I can't get closer to where I need to be. So I also think it makes you a more dynamic, involved photographer when you are actively moving your body and getting into where it is that you want to be with your subject. So try not to use your zoom. And then flash, I feel the same way about flash. It never looks natural when you're using flash on your phone camera. You can use flash and make it look natural with the fancy types of flashes that DSL cameras you can use with those cameras. I don't ever use flash, even for any of my business shooting. I feel like it instantly is going to change the feel of the environment that you're shooting in. And I think that with just a little bit of creativity and knowledge about natural light, you can create really beautiful pictures without flash. So my recommendations pretty much across the board are not to zoom and not to use flash. And then managing some tricky situations. We talked a little bit about messy backgrounds or backgrounds that have people in them that you don't want to be in the picture. Changing your perspective or using that portrait mode that we talked about can create enough of the black background blur so that there isn't an issue of like showing people that don't want to be photographed, or if you have a messy space in your kitchen or that sort of a thing. Those two options can really be helpful. And then action shots, if you are shooting action, like we have a swimming instructor, really having bright lights going to be helpful. So if you're shooting inside, I know some indoor pools can be a little bit darker. That can be a little bit of a challenge. So I recommend trying to shoot at a time of day when you're going to have the most natural light possible, or shooting outside or that sort of a thing where because you really need lots of bright light in order for action shots to be sharp and in focus, and you don't have that action blur. So the other thing I recommend is using burst mode to shoot through the moment. It's on, I could show you on my camera, but that feels clunky to go back over there again. But basically on my particular camera, which is an iPhone like 11, instead of clicking the shutter button, if you just hold it to the left, it is burst mode. So you like tap it and hold it to the left, or you don't actually tap it, you just put your finger on it and move it to the left, and you'll see the numbers adding up. It'll be like 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. And the reason that I recommend shooting in burst mode for action is a few things. One of them is that inevitably there's going to be a better looking moment in the action than what you first saw. And that happens to me all the time. I mean, even just recently with all the snow that we've had, I took a million pictures of my kids sledding. And I would think to myself, oh, this moment is perfect. And I would start it and shoot in burst mode. And it would really be like the 10th shot that I liked the best. It also helps because your camera's not always going to capture that moment in focus. And so if you have 15 of that moment, then one of them is going to be in focus. And then also, a lot of times, the reactions to the movement are more fun than the actual picture that you thought you wanted. So let's think about it in terms of the swimming instructor. You may have a kiddo, jumping into the pool, and you thought the jumping into the pool part would be the most fun, but really it was when they bounced right back out of the water, like smiling because they, are safe and they did it and they're so proud of themselves. So like shooting from the beginning of the moment all the way through until all the reactions are over can really help capture moments that you weren't even anticipating and capture them, in a focused way, because this one may not be focused, but this next one is focused. So really use that burst mode can be super helpful for that. So, and then editing on our smartphones, I don't think we're going to get into editing too much, but I will say that Lightroom Mobile is hands down my top recommendation for editing apps. I use Lightroom for all of my camera, my DSLR editing on my computer. And so the Lightroom Mobile was just a natural app for me to go with because it's seamless. I mean, it's almost identical. But Lightroom Mobile is incredibly powerful. I mean, it is amazingly powerful to be able to just do these things on your phone, down to the point where there's a free version and then there's a paid version. I don't think the free version has this option, but with the paid version, you can circle things in your picture that you want to get rid of, and you can just delete them out of the picture. You can spot edit. So like, let's say, even with your best intentions and your best shooting, somebody's face ended up being a little bit darker than you want it to be and a little bit too shadowed. You can just highlight their face and only increase exposure on their face, which is fantastic. You can add that overall exposure, or you can warm it up if it feels a little bit too cool. The Lightroom mobile app is fantastic, so I highly recommend that. And then Afterlight is another option. It's a little bit more simple. It has more filters, which I actually don't really super recommend. I don't love the look of most filters because I think they can be pretty heavy-handed and they can look a little bit dated. All that to say, within Lightroom Mobile, you can create your own preset, which means, let's say you own a bakery and you take 50% of your pictures in the kitchen. So you know that in the kitchen, for your pictures in the kitchen, you're always going to warm them up slightly. You're always going to increase exposure slightly. You're always going to, I don't know, any other variety of editing techniques that you might use. And you almost always use them for all of your kitchen pictures. You can create a preset in Lightroom Mobile that says kitchen pictures, or name it whatever you want. And then you can pull every new picture that you take into Lightroom Mobile, and you can click that one-click preset, and it puts the stuff that you like to do on all the pictures that look like, that you've chosen, that have the similar lighting, similar light temperature, that sort of a thing. So as opposed to using somebody else's filter that they have made, I recommend creating your own preset based specifically on your settings. So you may have, let's say in that bakery situation, you have certain pictures that you take in the kitchen that need to be edited one way. You have certain pictures that you take in the dining room that need to be edited one way. And maybe you have a patio and you have certain pictures that need to be edited for the patio. You can have all the different presets that you need, and they can each be a one-touch preset that would place all the same edits on those pictures. And then if you need to, you can go in and manually adjust things a little bit further. I think this is so helpful because it again, really simplifies your workflow. It makes it so that all of your pictures look really consistent and give sort of a feel to your Facebook or your Instagram feed. I think that can be really nice when somebody's scrolling through Instagram and they see a picture and they immediately know, hey, I know whose picture that is. That happens with me whenever I look at like Freckled Hen Farmhouse, which is a local shop here in Fayetteville. Her pictures all look similar enough and have a similar editing style and a similar technique to them that I know immediately when I see her pictures in my Instagram feed. So that's when you have those sorts of presets made that fit your situation specifically, it can be really awesome in that way. So some practical tips for getting the shot. One of the things that that I always say that always makes me laugh is keeping your lens cap clean. You know, we don't have a lens cap on our phone camera, and it is in our back pockets or in the bottom of our purse or in our briefcase or anywhere else. And mine gets so dirty. So I recommend, you know, just you don't even have to be precious or careful with it, like clean it on your shirt. But it makes a huge difference because when it's blurry or gunked up with something, it's going to instantly give you like the light that's coming in is going to feel streaky and blurry. It's never going to look focused. So just a quick swipe on your shirt to keep that lens cap clean And don't forget, you have a lens here on the front too that also needs to get cleaned. So we've got one on the back and one on the front. And then also from our lock screen, we can swipe left and it opens up our camera immediately. So that's something that's really helpful to remember, that you don't have to go into you don't have to unlock your phone in order to get to your camera. So if there's something that's happening that is time is of the essence and you really want to get to your camera quickly, you can just swipe left and there's your camera, which is really helpful. I recommend managing your camera roll because this is one of those do as I say, not as I do situations, because I recently transferred like 16,000 pictures off of my camera, my phone, because I was getting to the point where I couldn't take any more pictures because it was full. So don't get yourself in that situation. Really take time, set time in your schedule once a week to manage down your camera roll. And also, in addition to managing it down, you can create those folders like we talked about so that your portfolio is really organized. So you could have whatever would be applicable to your business, whether it is, client pictures. And so all of your edited, ready to go client pictures are all in the client pictures folder. Or let's say, pictures of customers eating in the restaurant. So that could be another folder in your camera roll, so that under another album, I think they call them albums. And whatever works best, whatever types of categories work best to be able to capture the different elements of your message that you're wanting to communicate. Having those pictures edited and ready to go, ready to post on social media, and organized in your camera roll just saves so much time. And then the next one is to tuck your arms to steady your camera. We talked a little bit about that when we were looking at the night mode on the camera, and whether that means balancing your arms on a countertop or tucking your arms in next to your side. If you're in a lower light situation, it can really help reduce that camera mode, the camera shake. And then you can consider preserve settings mode, which is within your camera, you have the option to choose to preserve the settings. And what that means is, I'm trying to find it so I can show you. It's actually in the regular phone settings. If you pull up the phone settings and the camera folder there is an option to preserve settings. And what that means is that, let's say that you love portrait mode and you almost always want to shoot everything in portrait mode. The default of our cameras is that when we open up the camera, it goes to the photo mode. But if you preserve settings, then it's going to always open to whatever settings you've decided you want to preserve. Maybe it's portrait mode, or maybe you really are into taking videos for your business, and so you want it to just default to opening to videos. That's not something that I do because I'm 45 and my brain has decided that it is the way it is. And I need my camera to always open the same way, even if I have to scroll really, really quickly to get to a different mode in my camera. But maybe that's helpful for you. Maybe it's helpful to know that every time you open up your camera, it's going to be on a different mode rather than photo mode. And I always have live photo off. I don't know what the point of live photo is. And I don't like it. And so if it's something that you also don't like, you can tell your phone to turn it off, and then it will not default to being on, which is the way my phone always defaulted until I specifically told it to turn off. And then keep a running shot list. Like I mentioned before, this is just such a helpful thing for so many clients that I've worked with. It can be very specific. It can, you can keep a list going, and literally like on your phone or on a piece of paper, just, you can write down, we just got this new therapy tool that we really want to capture, so I'm going to write that down. We don't have very many pictures of older kids, so I want to make sure that I get permission to take, 4 pictures of different older kids. Or maybe, I'm trying to think of some other examples. Whatever is applicable to your situation. Maybe you're getting new products in that you want to make sure that you are capturing, or maybe there's a holiday that's coming up that you want to make sure to communicate. We've got these new plants in for Mother's Day that's coming up. So you want to make sure to capture some photographs of the plants, as well as some moms and kids shopping together, or whatever would help tell the story in a more full, like creative way. Really having that shot list written down can be super helpful, and it'll just help you to shoot intentionally. And then practice, practice, practice. Like we've talked about a ton of stuff today, and it could be a little bit overwhelming to have all of these new terms and things in mind. But like I mentioned before, really pairing together a couple of new things to practice today. You know, today I want to practice. Today I really want to capture these new plants that we got in, and Mother's Day is coming up. So I'm going to use perspective to try to communicate that. And maybe that means, you know, shooting down over the top of a little kid and holding hands with his mom, or maybe that means shooting through some plants to get a different perspective for this, you know, for this holiday that's coming up that we really want to feature in our social media. So the intentional practice, and it feels, I'm sure, like a lot as a small business owner, because there's always a million things to do, but really taking, you know, 5 or 10 minutes once or twice a week can help build that portfolio gradually and in a really intentional, meaningful way. And having those pictures on the ready can also just take a lot of your social media pressure off, I find, to have these pictures that you can use. And you can reuse them. I mean, nobody's going to go back through, scroll back through your social media feed and see that you've used the same picture twice in a year, and you know, you don't get fired for that. Like we all reuse all of our favorite pictures. So having excuse me, having those pictures handy can really make a big difference. So, and I think I've already said all of this stuff. And the images also don't need to be new. I think sometimes we feel like a fraud or something if we're posting something on a Tuesday afternoon and it's not a picture that we just took. I think 99% of the people on Instagram and social media aren't using pictures that they just took. So feel free to create that proactive gallery and portfolio to be able to pull from whenever you need to. So I think that's all that we have there. I was going to see if I could try one more time to get to the video I wanted to show you. Can you see that?
While Nikki's looking to see if we can get that going, if you have any questions at all, go ahead and post them in the chat, and we'll try to get to those before we close.
So can you see the picture of the window here?
Yes. Well, I mean, I see it's practice and shoot and practice.
Oh no, okay, that's not it. I'm gonna try to. Oh, here it is. Now, can you see it?
Yes, there.
Okay. Okay, so I'm going to give a little introduction to this video while anybody's thinking of questions that they have. So like I mentioned, this is Sam Abel. He's a National Geographic photographer, and he is the one that I learned the microcomposition technique from. And the reason that I show this, now, there's a lot of things that aren't really applicable to us in this video. He's a professional photographer. He's in Moscow shooting for a job that he had. And he spends 12 hours working on this one picture, which is obviously not, you know, relevant to any of us. Even as a photographer myself, I never have 12 hours to take one picture. But I think it's so inspiring because he's really being intentional and he's thinking through the scene. And so it's just a couple of minutes, and I think it's fun to watch him. And he talks through his thought process with each different picture that he takes. So hopefully you can hear the sound when I play it.
In photography.
Can you hear him?
Yes, I could. Yes, I can hear.
Okay.
Is in studying how photographs get a life. 1 billion photographs will be made today, and 1 billion tomorrow, and 1 billion yesterday. Few survive to have a life. Why is that? This is a day off in my life. It's in June 1983. The story I'm working on is the life of Tolstoy, and I am being closely watched. It's a very cold part, a very chilly part of the Cold War. And I turned around once, and there were 13 people with me, watching me, minding me, guiding me, shepherding me, interpreting for me. And on this day off, I didn't want to go out on the streets. I didn't want to have an entourage. I wanted a day off. It was a Sunday. I awoke and I walked over to the window, and in the foreground were pears that my wife had bought the day before on the black market. I made a Polaroid. I looked at it. I got out my camera and tripod, and I devoted the next 12 hours to this window and these pears. The first thing I did was take the curtain away. The pavement begins to dry. Buses arrive. People walk across the now drying pavement. I micro-compose them. I'm only looking at them. Later in the day, I get the very bad idea to turn this highly horizontal scene vertical. But I still try to make the best picture I can, framing the spire of the Kremlin and the folds of the curtain and waiting for a man to complete the composition. But it's a bad idea, and I want to stress that. It doesn't look like a bad idea compared to this incredibly bad idea of replacing the Kremlin, St. Basil's Cathedral, the sky, and the National Museum of History with cars, pavement, and trucks. But I'm looking for something, and I found it. What I'm looking for is a horizontal line. It happens to be a dull, useless, concrete windowsill outside the window, but it cleanly divides the picture. And this is an attempt on my part to take this situation and make it mine. Give it the horizontal line of Ohio. That decision, made in the context of a worthless photograph, unlocked the picture. And now when I returned, still to take another very bad photograph, where I use a 21mm lens up close to gigantically enlarge the pears and incomprehensibly shrink the Kremlin, I've made, in the middle of the picture, the key to the final photograph. And that is the horizontal line of the window frame. 12 hours have passed on this day off. And now I'm only looking at one layer. And it isn't the pears, it's not the window or the window frame. It's not the Kremlin, the museum, or St. Basil's Cathedral. I'm only composing the back layer because I'm a back to front photographer. Why am I composing the back layer? It's the only layer in motion. The rest of this is a still life. One thing is missing, the front layer. I've returned the curtain to the composition. And now I'm not staring at the sky, the cathedral, the Kremlin, the window, or the pears. I'm staring down the curtain, and I'm not even looking at all of it. I'm only looking at one part of it. As the wind lifts the curtain into the room, it lifts the hem of the curtain, the satin hem, into the bottom of the composition. And that's what I'm composing, that lyrical line of satin ribbon. In the same way, I was only looking at the blue umbrella. I was only looking at the horseshoe in the sky, not the cowboy, not the tent, not the landscape. Staring down one thing, because it's that one thing that gives life to the photograph. 5 a.m. Midday. Mistake, mistake, back layer only, final photograph. The photograph has had a life. It was published double page by the Geographic, and it was named one of the 50 greatest photographs ever made at National Geographic a few years ago. I mention that because of what I'm about to say next. It was made on a day off.
anyway, I love to share that video because I think that, sorry. I think that it's so inspiring to hear his thought process and to hear him talk about the mistakes that he made. Like, he was just playing, he was playing around and trying different things, which I think is super inspiring for me as a photographer who takes pictures all the time. I love the fact that he, tried a lot of things that ended up not working well. And I think that it can be inspiring for a beginner photographer to see this person who ended up shooting this picture that was named one of the best pictures in National Geographic magazine, but to hear all of the mistakes that he made along the way. So I think that I just love to to share that video whenever I can. So that's all I have for today. So if anybody has any questions or comments or things that you'd like to chat about, I'd love to hear them.
That video was really interesting to see his process and then to see his final photograph. I loved that.
It was really cool. He goes on to say, it's like a 2-hour long presentation that he gives, but he goes on to say that it was printed on the cover of Harper magazine, which he said was one of his favorite magazines. And it was such an honor to have his photograph printed on the cover of this magazine, but they printed it backwards. So instead of the pears coming down the left side of the frame, they flipped it and the pears were coming down the right side of the frame. And he said that he wrote a letter to Harper magazine to try to explain to them what it feels like to have your work printed backwards. And his letter was a photograph a photograph of the magazine flipped so that all the words and everything were backwards. It was really funny.
So I don't see any additional questions. A couple of thank yous to you, Nikki, and I am going to share our contact information for those of you who might need to reach out to us. There's a QR code that will take you to our website, our email and phone contact information. Again, we are with the University of Arkansas and also grant funded by the SBA and various other organizations. So all of our services are complimentary, and we're happy to be able to bring you some of these educational products. And I want to thank Nikki again. So if there are no other questions, then we will.
Gabby does have a question. She said that you said we can see this in the website, correct? I had to take a call and miss a little bit. The recording. She's wondering if this will be recorded so that she can, I guess she missed a little part of it.
Yes, I will have the full recording up, hopefully by the end of today, but definitely by tomorrow.
Great.
So I had posted in the chat the link to our resources library, and that's where you'll find it. Okay, anything else, Nikki, that you would like to?
Nope, I think
mention?
That's all I've got for today. Thank you guys so much for coming. It was fantastic. It's always fun to talk about smartphone photography with everybody.
Yes, thanks for joining us, and we hope to see you next time.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.